So I'm not really sure if it's appropriate to title the book Dragon Rider if the dragon is the size of a house cat. Welcome to Reading Crossbow. My name is Rob, and today I'm doing my midpoint review on Dragon Rider by Taran Matharu. This was an epic fantasy book that was selected for us to read this month by Lana. And wow, she frickin' nailed it. This is a terrific book so far. I have only great things to say for the most part. This first half of this book has been just a joy, and I want to talk about it. So the world of Dragon Rider feels a lot like the later Roman Empire. The empire has already been brought into existence. It's conquered most of its neighbors. Its other neighbors are a little more further afield, and the economy of this empire is largely driven by the chattel slavery of all the conquered peoples that have been brought back and are now being forced to work on behalf of this empire. So the main character of this book, Jai, is actually a hostage. He's not a slave, but he's kind of being treated like one. You see, his father was a warlord from one of these outer territories who had risen up against the empire. And while he was eventually defeated, his sons, and he has 3 sons that we know of, were basically taken as hostages by the empire to make sure that these horsemen, called the steppe folk, out on the fringe of the empire, basically don't attack the empire any further. So they're basically being held as hostage, and if they were to attack, these 3 boys would be killed. Now, according to the deal, these 3 boys, as they come of age, they will each be set free and they can go back to their homeland. This is where the story actually is kind of almost at its strongest, is just the building up of this world. It's hard to explain how much fun it is to just see how this world grows through the eyes of an outsider. It's a great audience surrogate character because he can, even though he's kind of been inside this country for, I think, a decade, he's had an extremely sheltered life as he's been essentially the manservant for the retired emperor. So kind of like in the Apple TV Foundation series, there's the retired emperor, the current emperor, and then the next emperor in waiting. And this kind of 3-person family, they rule the Sabine Empire. And so Jai is kind of like the usher or the servant for the retired emperor, and has been almost its entire, at least within his memory. So he spends all of his time just with the old retired emperor. He doesn't really get to see much of the actual world. And so at the start of this story, he's really starting to finally learn more about this world, given his extremely sheltered childhood. So the way this takes place is that there's a kingdom to the north, a very cold, snowy territory with, the barbarians, in quotes, that are to the northern border of this empire. They would fill in as like the Germanics or Scandinavians to Romans. But in this case, this kingdom, which is called the Dansk, they're the only people who have been able to bond with dragons. And they have that as a secret. And in order to try to achieve peace with the Sabine Empire, they're willing to share that secret as a dowry in order to marry their princess to the empire's heir, the crown prince. And this is where the story kind of kicks off, is Jai is kind of watching as events unfold. Now, if you try to pick up this book, and I'm not going to spoil the lead, I would recommend you pick up this book. This has been great so far. But this very first, like maybe quarter of the book might come across as being a little slow, because this part of the book is very much a court intrigue type of story, as Jai gets to witness this Sabine-Dansk union as these two, the Empire and the Kingdom, are kind of trying to come together and achieve a long-lasting peace. Now, this is actually, the reason why I said this is almost one of my favorite parts of this book is there's just so much world building here, and there's just so many clues that are constantly being dropped. Every time you turn, there's some sort of, whether you want to call it foreshadowing or maybe call it Chekhov's gun, there's always like something being dropped that's going to be picked up later. And you might not understand how it's going to be picked up, but you can definitely tell, oh, they're hinting at something, or they're showing you something. It's going to be important later. So this is what I feel is like maybe the strongest aspect of this tale as far as the author is concerned, because he does a just terrific job of showing, not telling. And what I mean by that is, for example, we talked about bonding with a dragon. Well, it turns out you can actually, in this world, you can bond with just about anything. They talk about bonding with cats and birds, but there's limits to that. You know, there's only so much a cat can really do for you. So people are more interested in bonding the more fantastical creatures that exist in this world. Obviously, we already mentioned dragons, but there's also griffins. There's a chamrosh, which is I think it's an Iranian mythological bird, giant bird. There's also manticores that were mentioned, and dire wolves. So there's lots of different creatures that can be bonded in this world. They even mention someone tried bonding an insect, and while it worked, they went mad because the insect's mind was so alien, it drove the human mad, and they just died. But to get back to what I was saying, the reason why I say this book really shows, doesn't tell, is very early on, you get to see what happens when a bonded human dies. What happens to their animal? What happens if the animal dies but not the human? All of these things are kind of shown. They also show, way before it's actually needed, this idea called soul breathing, which is a way you pull in mana as a person that's bonded to an animal. And I think this is where I mentioned earlier that the author really does a great job, is all of these things are shown well before they're actually explained. So I think it's pretty obvious that, the guy on the cover, the main character and only point of view character, Jai, he's going to become, a dragon rider. So it's actually really useful for the reader to be able to experience all of these ideas well before Jai, who one doesn't know any of this, has to basically learn them. Now, he does get a mentor character who can help him learn, but because this is all very foreign to him, he has to kind of learn things, and things have to be explained to him. But they don't necessarily have to be explained to the reader, because we've actually already seen it happen. And in fact, Jai actually saw all of those things I mentioned earlier. He saw those happen himself. So he doesn't have to ask, such as what happens when the human dies? What happens to the animal? Or vice versa. He's already seen it happen. So this is what I mean by this is kind of the best part of this story, because it's a slow burn world building as you get to see this alliance unfold and the just courtly intrigue that's occurring between these rival nations. So at about the second quarter of this book is when Jai sees an opportunity to free himself from being a hostage and try to make his way home. And in the process, he bonds a dragon, meets a handmaiden, and takes her with him. Consensually, he's helping her. And he has to head out onto the road. And he has to kind of learn about what it means to be bonded to a creature, specifically a dragon. And, this has been just a riot this whole time so far. And I don't really want to give away too many spoilers. As I said, at this point in the book, I'm only halfway through. They've really only just kind of made it out into the countryside. And this is now, the story has progressed from being a court intrigue story to a slow chase scene as Jai and Frida are basically trying to flee the Empire ahead of the army and the other soul-bonded Griffin Guard, who are basically the elite military of the Sabine Empire. And they're just trying to stay ahead of that and flee the Empire and get back to their homes. A lot of effort does get saved. As I mentioned, the book doesn't have to do big dumps of information to explain things, because a lot of things kind of got explained naturally over the course of the story. So if you're reading the start of this book and you're like, man, this seems like it's going real slow, or maybe this is not the kind of book I thought this was, because it seems like a court story, that's going to change. Just get through that, but pay attention, because I think a lot of the things that were described or hinted at in the beginnings of this book are going to just pay dividends later on. Every time Taran, the author, mentions different things in this story, they almost always come back. And it's kind of almost a fun little scavenger hunt to try to guess at, how's that going to be useful later on? Or maybe how these pieces are actually going to come together and become something more interesting. Now, you might be able to guess at maybe as you're reading, you might be able to guess maybe some of the twists in this story. But for the most part, I think it's all executed very well. And this book has absolutely been terrific so far. Like I said, we get a really interesting magic system, which we will definitely be talking about next week. You get the whole bonds with animals, especially dragon. So my chief issue, essentially, with the book so far is I feel a little misled by the cover. See, when I first looked at the cover, I thought that was a shield or maybe a war fan, until I noticed that there's a dragon back there. And so, the name of the book is Dragon Rider. So I thought the dragon was maybe back well behind him, and they're showing it small to be proportional so that the dragon doesn't dominate the screen, since this is a book about Jai. I think the dragon is too big in this picture. The dragon is tiny. So they described the dragon as being about the size of a house cat, and she rides on the neck of Jai while they're traveling. Unless there's a big time jump or dragons age like incredibly fast, I don't think there's going to be any dragon riding in this book. Maybe they should have called this like the dragon foster parent, or dragon husbandry, or how to raise a dragon. Not dragon rider. Maybe save dragon rider for the next book. Call this one Dragon Soul or Dragon Bond, but who knows? I could totally be wrong. They're going to do like a 5-year time jump midway through. I don't see it happening, but it's possible. And he's going to be riding this dragon by the end of the book, slaying. So I don't see that happening. I think that's a bit of a stretch. And therefore, that is my only real criticism of the book so far. So as far as the world is concerned, like I said, you have the Sabine Empire in the middle. To the north, you have the Dansk and similar culture nations. There's actually, it sounds like a bunch of them up there. It's just the Dansk are particularly special because they know how to bond dragons. So to the south, there seems to be another region that's very much a desert area. There's some cities out in the desert. It has a very North Africa kind of feel. But so far, I don't think that's within the scope of this book. And then to the east is the steppe lands. And this is where Jai comes from. And that definitely seems inspired by the Eurasian steppe peoples and region. Huge grasslands, very nomadic peoples. And so while it does feel like there was a lot of shorthand was done here by being inspired by the real world, but I find that this level of inspiration was actually very beneficial to the story. It's very lightly hinted at, and you just get a feel for the world without having to have all the minutiae explained. They even have an equivalent of the Silk Road, which they call the Kashmir Road, because, switching a noun makes it totally different. So on the far side of the steppe, there's another area called the Phoenix Land or Empire, or Phoenix Kingdom, and I can only assume they have Kashmir, but don't have a lot of information about that yet. So yeah, this has been a pretty really interesting story so far. The world building has been on point. The show don't tell has been amazing. Favorite in a while. But most especially, the magic has been very cool. It's a very different kind of magic. It builds on a lot of things and common tropes, such as the concepts like mana, bonding dragons, which is very common, but also even like fireballs and magic swords and stuff like that. There's even a few kind of almost D&D like moments where the people try to go stay at an inn or a tavern, and which includes it's a place you drink, and then when you're done drinking you sleep there with all the other people, just on bedrolls and stuff. So it does feel like a very relatable, easily understood story. I think I'm just going to stop it here. I only really have great things to say about this book, except for, the whole Dragon Rider thing. I think that's a misleading title, at least so far. But be sure you come back next week. Lana will be here. We'll both have finished this book, and we'll be able to kind of put to rest, is this a cool epic fantasy story that rivals books like The Fourth Wing, or is this something else entirely? Well, I'm excited to read the second half, and I think you should try to read it with us too. So be sure to come back next week. We'll do the final review. So make sure you do all the usual YouTube stuff, the whole liking and subscribing. We've been doing really well. The channel's really grown quite a bit over the last month and a half, and we're excited to see where this is going.